Have you ever driven down a lonely road late at night, surrounded by fields and dark tree lines, and felt like you weren't truly alone? Eli Turner always thought the quiet of rural Ohio roads meant peace, until the night he saw a figure standing perfectly still by mile marker 23. Something about the way the man didn't move or speak pressed against the silence Eli had always trusted. Later, a deputy told him, "You're not the first to see him." That simple sentence stuck with Eli, turning every late-night drive into a reminder that some roads carry more than just memories. For Eli, the man at mile marker 23 wasn't just a story. He was a presence that changed the way the road felt under his tires. Eli had never been the type to scare easily. His work as a freelance graphic designer meant long hours and late drives across stretches of Ohio that most people only saw in daylight. The quiet was something he'd come to rely on. He liked the way the country roads felt at night, empty except for the sound of his own truck and the occasional coyote in the distance. He'd roll the window down and let the cold air snap him awake, thinking how the world felt smaller and simpler when it was just him and the road. There was nothing unusual about that October night at first. The sky was clear, and the fields on either side of the road looked silver in the moonlight. Eli drove the same route home he always did, passing abandoned farmhouses, empty barns, and the mile markers that blurred past without a second thought. Until he approached mile marker 23. He saw the figure before he even realized he'd slowed down. The man was tall and thin, standing just off the shoulder, hands buried deep in his pockets, a faded flannel shirt and jeans, the brim of a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't move, not even when Eli's headlights swept over him. Eli's first instinct was to help. Maybe the guy's car had broken down, or he'd gotten lost. Out here, it wasn't unusual to come across someone who needed a ride or a jump. But as Eli pulled up and stopped, the man didn't react. He didn't wave, didn't step forward, didn't even look up. He just stood there, perfectly still, as if he'd been waiting for something else entirely. Eli rolled down his window and called out, "You all right, buddy?" The only answer was the soft hiss of the wind and the faint static from Eli's radio. The man didn't move. Eli tried again, louder. "Need a hand?" Something wrong? Still nothing. The silence was heavy, thicker than usual, like the night had swallowed up every sound except the low idle of Eli's engine. The world felt muted, as if everything had paused for a moment. The man's face was hard to make out, features blurred by shadow and the brim of his cap, but Eli thought he looked about 40, maybe a little older. There was nothing remarkable about his clothes or his stance, except for the way he didn't shift, didn't even seem to breathe. Something about the stillness made Eli uneasy. He'd been through rough winters and seen his share of folks stranded or stumbling home from bars, but this was different. The longer he sat there, the more the sense of normalcy faded. Eli's hand hovered near the radio dial, unsure whether to turn up the volume or just drive away. That's when he caught a whisper buried in the static. A faint voice that seemed to say, "Don't stop." He'd heard stories about odd voices on empty roads, but in that moment, it felt less like imagination and more like a warning that belonged to the place itself. He hesitated, not wanting to leave someone in trouble, but every instinct told him to go. "All right then, you take care now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He rolled up the window and eased the truck forward, eyes flicking to the side mirror. The man stayed in place, shrinking into the darkness as Eli drove away. The rest of the drive home was a blur. Eli kept glancing at the empty seat beside him, replaying the encounter in his mind. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just a tired mind playing tricks. But the image of the silent man wouldn't leave him. When he got home, he stood in the kitchen for a long time, keys still in his hand, thinking about what he'd seen. He thought about calling the sheriff's office, but for a while he just stood there, unsure if he'd sound foolish or if he'd done the right thing by leaving. The next day, his phone rang. It was a deputy who worked the area near mile marker 23. The deputy's voice was steady but tired, like he'd had this conversation before. "You're not the first to see him," the deputy said. "That's Daniel Harper's truck. He disappeared 3 years ago. Folks say he still shows up at mile 23. The words landed with a weight Eli hadn't expected. The deputy explained that they'd found a battered pickup in the ditch near where Eli had stopped. The keys were still in the ignition, a half-empty coffee cup in the holder. The registration matched Daniel Harper, age 42, missing since a cold spring night 3 years earlier. Eli listened, trying to make sense of it. The deputy didn't offer any theories, just facts. Other drivers had reported seeing a man standing by the mile marker, always in the same spot, always silent. Some said they'd heard whispers on the radio. Others just felt a pull to stop. No one who stopped ever got an answer. The truck stayed where it was, rusted and forgotten in the weeds, but the sightings continued. After the call, Eli avoided that stretch of road. He took longer routes, found reasons to stay late in town, anything to keep from passing mile marker 23. When he finally did, weeks later, he kept his hands tight on the wheel and his eyes straight ahead. The mile markers blurred by, most hidden behind overgrown grass or faded by weather, but when he saw 23, he felt his chest tighten. The wooden post leaned to one side, vines curling around the base. The sky above it was empty, but Eli pressed harder on the gas, refusing to look back. The memory of the man lingered for months. Sometimes Eli would wake in the night, the image of that figure standing by the road as clear as if he'd just seen him. He talked about it with friends, but the words never seemed to fit. The explanation he'd been given only raised more questions. Was Daniel Harper still waiting for someone to stop? Was there something about that patch of road that refused to let go? The part that stayed with Eli wasn't just the mystery, but the way the road felt different now. Places that once seemed peaceful were marked by a sense of absence, as if the past was closer than he'd realized. He wasn't the only one who'd felt it. In quiet towns and along empty highways, there are people who keep their eyes on the shoulder, wondering if they'll see someone who isn't supposed to be there. And sometimes, the urge to stop and help is stronger than the fear. There are drivers who can't ignore a figure by the roadside, no matter how late the hour or how empty the world feels. Some people are drawn to help, even when the story doesn't make sense. Rachel Monroe's route home wound through County Road 14 near the Miller farm, a stretch of road she knew better than most. Working nights as a nurse in Shelby, Indiana, meant long hours and a kind of tired that settled deep in her bones, but the quiet drive usually helped her let go of the hospital's fluorescent lights and steady alarms. The road was little more than a thin ribbon of asphalt pressed between empty fields, with only the occasional porch light in the distance to break up the darkness. Rachel didn't mind the solitude. She left the radio off, letting the hum of tires and the chirr of crickets fill the cab. That night, she spotted someone standing just beyond the curve, where the road bent around a stand of old sycamores. The figure was a woman, her outline thrown into sharp relief by Rachel's headlights. She wore a long coat, and a red scarf looped around her neck. The color was the first thing Rachel noticed, a bright, almost jarring streak against the washed-out backdrop of the road and fields. The woman stood with her head slightly bowed, hands hidden in her sleeves, not signaling or waving, just waiting. Rachel slowed down. It was late, well past midnight, and the nearest town was miles away. She glanced up and down the road for a sign of a stalled car or another person, but there was nothing but the empty stretch behind and ahead. Something about the scene tugged at her, a mix of concern and a nurse's instinct that someone might need help. She pulled over and rolled down her window. "Hey there," she called, her voice sounding too loud in the hush. "Are you all right? Need some help?" The woman looked up, moving closer to the truck. Her face was pale and still, the lines around her mouth and eyes marked by age and worry. Rachel guessed she was maybe in her mid-50s. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and dry. "My car broke down," she said, not meeting Rachel's eyes. Rachel leaned out the window, scanning the roadside. "Where's your car?" she asked, but the woman only replied, "Further back," her words trailing off like she wasn't sure. Rachel hesitated, but the woman didn't seem dangerous, just tired, maybe lost. "I can give you a ride," Rachel offered. "Where do you need to go?" The woman seemed to think it over, then stepped around to the passenger side. Rachel unlocked the door, watching as the woman climbed in, the red scarf pooling in her lap. She sat rigidly, her hands folded over the scarf, gaze fixed on the windshield. "So, where to?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her tone light. "There's a park up ahead," the woman said quietly. "Just drop me at the corner." They drove in silence. Rachel glanced at her a few times, noting how the woman barely moved, her posture stiff, her attention locked on the empty road ahead. The scarf's color seemed even bolder in the dim light of the cab, a sharp contrast to the rest of her. When they reached the park, a patch of trees and a gravel lot washed in moonlight, Rachel eased the truck to a stop. "Here, okay?" she asked. The woman nodded, gripping the scarf. She turned, offering a thin, almost apologetic smile. "Thank you," she said. "You're the first to stop in a long time." Rachel blinked, unsettled by the phrasing. Before she could ask anything else, the woman opened the door and stepped out, her coat brushing the seat. She walked away without looking back, vanishing into the shadows beneath the trees. Rachel sat for a moment, engine idling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The encounter hadn't felt threatening, but there was a weight to it, a sadness she couldn't shake. She drove the rest of the way home with the window cracked, letting the cold air clear her head. The next morning, Rachel mentioned the encounter to her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who stopped by for eggs. Rachel described the woman's coat, her age, the way she'd spoken. She mentioned the red scarf, how it seemed to glow in the darkness. Mrs. Jenkins's face changed. She set her mug down, hands still. "You saw her?" she asked, her voice suddenly quiet. Rachel frowned, not sure what she meant. There was a pause. Mrs. Jenkins leaned closer, her voice dropping. "There's never been any car." She let the words hang there, the kitchen silent except for the ticking clock. Rachel stared, unsure what to say. Mrs. Jenkins explained, her words careful and measured, that people had seen the woman for years, always on that same stretch of County Road 14, always late at night, always wearing the red scarf. No one ever saw a car, and no one ever saw her during the day. Sometimes she'd ask for a ride. Sometimes she'd just stand there, waiting. "She's been out there since before I moved here," Mrs. Jenkins said. "Some folks say she's looking for a way home. Others think she's waiting for someone to come back for her." Rachel listened, her mind replaying the woman's quiet voice and the way she'd thanked her. The story unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just the strangeness of picking up someone who might not even be alive. It was the sense that the woman was trapped, tied to that lonely patch of road by something she couldn't let go. That night, Rachel drove home by a different route. She found herself glancing at the side of the road anyway, half expecting to see the flash of red in her headlights. The fields and trees pressed close, and the road felt a little less safe, a little less empty. Stories like these stick with you. They change the way you see familiar places, make you wonder what else might be waiting in the dark, just beyond the reach of your headlights. Rachel tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just a story, just a tired mind playing tricks. But the memory of the woman in the red scarf lingered, a reminder that not every stranger by the roadside is looking for help, or even for a ride. Some stories are warnings, passed from neighbor to neighbor, growing stranger with every retelling. And sometimes the warning comes not from a stranger, but from someone who knows exactly what can happen when you ignore the signs. Ben Carter didn't put much stock in ghost stories. Growing up, he'd heard all the usual tales, strange lights in old barns, footsteps in the attic, the usual rural rumors, but he never saw the point. He trusted what he could see and fix with his own hands. Engines, fencing, the steady rhythm of chores. Stories about spirits seemed like just another way to pass the time. He liked driving late at night, especially when the house felt too quiet or the day had dragged on too long. The roads in upstate New York wound through woods and fields, sometimes so empty it felt like the world had shrunk to just his truck and the dark. One night, detouring around roadwork, he found himself on a route he didn't use often. It was still familiar, but there was something about the way the trees pressed close, the way the fog settled low even though the sky had been clear. That made him keep both hands on the wheel. He came up on the old railroad crossing before he realized where he was. The wooden barrier looked brittle, barely upright, and the tracks themselves were half swallowed by weeds and gravel. The place had a reputation for feeling colder and quieter than the rest of the road, and Ben found himself slowing down without thinking. As his headlights swept over the crossing, he saw someone standing just past the far track. A boy, small, maybe 10 or 11, his frame slight under a red windbreaker zipped to his chin. The brightness of the jacket was jarring, a splash of color against the gray and green. The boy's jeans were too big, bunching around his ankles, and his feet were bare, skin pale against the dark gravel. Ben eased to a stop, rolling down his window. The air that came in was colder than it should have been. "Hey, kid," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. The boy's head jerked up, quick and stiff, like he hadn't heard a voice in a long time. His face was thin and pale, almost gray in the glare of the headlights. There was fear in his eyes, real fear, sharp and urgent. "You shouldn't stop here," the boy said. His voice was thin, shaking. "Don't stop here." Ben felt a chill work its way up his arms. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe the kid was lost. Maybe there was a car broken down nearby. "Are you okay? Where are your shoes?" Ben asked, but the boy didn't answer. He just stared, shoulders hunched, hands trembling at his sides. "Go," the boy said, softer now, but the urgency in his voice was clear. "Please go." Ben wanted to ask more, but the words stuck. The boy turned, looking straight at the tracks, and in an instant, he was gone. One moment he was there, the red windbreaker bright in the headlights, and then the spot was empty. Ben blinked, his eyes searching the tracks for any movement, but all he saw was the empty gravel glinting in the light, the space where the boy had stood as blank as if nothing had ever been there. He sat there for a long moment, hands tight on the wheel, listening to the engine idle and the wind press against the cab. The warning echoed in his head. "Don't stop here." It felt less like advice and more like something urgent, a message meant for him alone. He made it home without looking in the rearview mirror. The next morning, he couldn't shake the image of the boy, bare feet, red jacket, the way he'd vanished without a sound. He walked over to Mrs. O'Leary's house, hoping she'd have a practical explanation. She was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's business, and if there was a kid running around out there, she'd know. He described what he'd seen: the boy's age, the red windbreaker, the bare feet, the warning. Mrs. O'Leary listened, her hands still on her mug, her eyes fixed on the table. When he finished, she looked up and said, "That's the boy who ran in front of the train years ago. He's been warning drivers ever since." Ben tried to picture it. A kid running late, maybe trying to beat the train, not seeing it coming until it was too late. Mrs. O'Leary said people had talked about him for years, always at the old crossing, always after dark. Drivers would see him standing there, sometimes waving, sometimes just staring, but always telling them not to stop. "He's trying to keep folks from ending up like him," she said. Ben wanted to dismiss it, but the details matched too closely. The boy's clothes, the warning, the way he'd vanished, none of it fit the usual explanations. Over the next few days, Ben started listening more closely to the stories he'd always ignored. At the diner, he heard a couple of truckers trading tales about the old crossing. One of them, a man with a voice like gravel, said, "Saw a kid in red out there once. Told me to move on. Didn't see him after that, but I never stop at that crossing now." It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Ben stopped using that road. If he had to cross tracks anywhere, he kept moving, eyes straight ahead. The warning stuck with him, not just as a memory but as a rule. Don't stop here. He wondered if the boy was still out there every night, waiting for someone to listen. Sometimes places marked by tragedy hold onto the past in ways that don't fade with time. Ben's story was just one among many. Drivers with their own reasons for keeping to the main roads, avoiding certain crossings, or never stopping when something felt off. The empty tracks, the fog, the hush that settles over places where accidents linger in memory. It all becomes part of the landscape, shaping how people move through the night. And on some roads, especially the ones that seem to stretch forever across fields or through woods, you never know what you'll find waiting just beyond the headlights. The quiet can feel safe, or it can feel like a warning. Either way, it's enough to make you pay attention to every shape in the dark and every story you hear at the end of a long drive. Tyler Brooks never expected much from a late-night drive on Highway 385. The Texas plains could stretch for hours without a turn or a sign of life. He liked the emptiness, just the steady thrum of his tires, the dry smell of the air after a distant rain, and the way the sky pressed down, full of stars that seemed to go on forever. Out here, the road felt like it belonged to him alone. It was past midnight when he first saw the lights. He was about 40 minutes from home, the highway so still he could almost forget the rest of the world existed. He reached for his water bottle and looked up, catching a flicker low on the horizon. At first it looked like a line of headlights, but dimmer than anything modern. They moved in a tight group, dipping and rising with the uneven road. As he got closer, he realized these weren't trucks or SUVs. They were Jeeps. Not the kind you'd see at a dealership, but old military models, the sort with flat grills and rounded fenders. 3 of them, spaced perfectly, rolling in formation. The Jeeps looked like they'd driven straight out of a black and white photograph. Olive drab paint, faded but still solid under the moonlight. Each one had a white star stenciled on the side, the edges soft with age. The canvas tops were pulled tight, no sign of dirt or wear. Tyler slowed down, curiosity edging out the routine of the drive. He wondered if there was some kind of vintage rally happening, but nothing about the scene fit. The jeeps moved with a kind of precision that felt out of place, almost rehearsed. He matched their speed, drifting behind the convoy for a minute. The road was so quiet that he expected to hear engines, but there was nothing. Not the low growl of an old motor or the crunch of gravel under tires, only the wind against his window and the faint creak of his seat. The silence felt heavy, as if the world had paused around them. Tyler pulled into the opposite lane to pass, his headlights sweeping over the last jeep. The men behind the wheels wore army uniforms from another era, wool jackets, faded patches, and caps pulled low. Their faces were young and pale, eyes fixed straight ahead. None of them glanced over as he drew even with them. Their hands rested loose on the wheels, but their bodies didn't move. He couldn't tell if they were breathing. The blankness of their expressions unsettled him more than anything else. It was like looking at mannequins, posed for a photograph and left behind. He kept his foot steady on the gas, inching forward. The closer he got, the more the silence pressed in. There was no radio static, no engine noise, just the soft hum of his own truck and the pounding of his heart. As he reached the middle jeep, he noticed the first one's headlights flicker. The yellow beams dimmed, then faded out completely. The jeep itself began to lose shape, the olive paint and white star dissolving into the night. He blinked hard, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the second jeep followed, its lights guttering, its outline blurring until it was gone. Within seconds, all three jeeps and their drivers had vanished, leaving nothing but empty pavement in front of him. Tyler slammed on the brakes. His truck shuddered to a stop, tires humming against the asphalt. He stared at the spot where the convoy had been, searching for any sign. Tire tracks, a wisp of dust, a glint of metal. There was nothing. The highway stretched ahead, flat and silent, as if the jeeps had never been there at all. He sat there, hands tight on the wheel, trying to slow his breathing. Every explanation he thought of, fatigue, a trick of the light, some kind of elaborate reenactment, fell apart the longer he replayed the moment in his mind. The feeling of dread lingered, a cold weight in his chest that didn't lift even after he forced himself to drive the rest of the way home. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he stayed in the truck for a long time. The memory of those faces, the way the headlights faded, wouldn't leave him. He wondered if he'd imagined it, if maybe the long drive and the empty road had gotten to him more than he realized. But the details were too sharp. The olive drab paint, the white stars, the silence that swallowed everything else. The next morning, he called his grandfather. The old man listened quietly as Tyler described what he'd seen. When Tyler finished, there was a pause. Then his grandfather said, "Caught in a storm, wiped out. Jeeps, drivers, all of them. They still wander Highway 385. The words settled between them, heavy and certain. His grandfather explained that during the war, convoys were a common sight out there. One group never made it home, lost in a sudden storm that rolled across the plains. For years after, people had talked about seeing the same jeeps, the same soldiers, moving in silence down the empty highway. Tyler tried to shake it off, but the story stuck with him. He avoided that stretch of road when he could. Sometimes, though, he'd find himself thinking about the convoy, wondering if they were still out there, searching for a way home that didn't exist. A few weeks later, at a truck stop outside Amarillo, Tyler overheard two drivers swapping stories over coffee. One of them, a man with a sunburned neck and a battered cap, said he'd seen a line of old jeeps on the highway late one night. "Didn't hear a thing," he said, "and then they just faded out, like they were never there." The other driver nodded, not surprised. "That's the convoy. They say you're lucky if all you get is a glimpse. Tyler didn't join in. He just listened, feeling the weight of their words. It was clear he wasn't the only one who'd seen something he couldn't explain. The stories were out there, passed quietly from one driver to the next, each one adding another layer to the mystery. Even now, Tyler can't drive a lonely highway without thinking of those Jeeps. The memory is always close, a line of headlights, the pale faces of young men, the way they vanished without a trace. The experience changed the way he saw empty roads. What once felt like freedom now carried a sense of something unfinished, a reminder that some journeys never end. The highways across Texas look empty, but sometimes the past lingers just out of sight, moving beside you in the dark. These roads hold more than just travelers. They carry stories, memories, and sometimes things that refuse to be forgotten. And as you drive on, you start to wonder if the road is ever as empty as it seems. Some highways are more than just long stretches of pavement. They collect stories and carry them forward, collecting the weight of what's left unfinished. Eli's silent figure, Rachel's red scarf, Ben's warning boy, Tyler's convoy. Each of these encounters isn't just a personal mystery. Together they reveal how certain places on the map act as archives of the unresolved, holding on to tragedy and longing well after the original events have faded from memory. The feeling of unease that settles in during a night drive isn't just about the darkness or the quiet. It's about the sense that something else lingers, shaped by loss or sorrow that hasn't found a resting place. Psychologists say that driving alone at night changes how we process what we see and hear. The mind, stripped of distractions, becomes more alert. Every flicker of movement, every odd shadow stands out. On roads like the one near mile marker 23, this heightened awareness is more than a quirk of the senses. It's the reason why, every fall, deputies get a handful of calls from drivers who say they saw a man standing by the marker, always in the same spot, always silent. These repeated sightings give the experience a kind of structure, turning a fleeting moment into a pattern that others recognize. That's where the stories start to overlap. Patterns matter. When Rachel heard from her neighbor that the woman in the red scarf had been seen for years, her own doubts started to fade. The same thing happened for Ben, who learned from Mrs. O'Leary that the boy at the crossing wasn't just a trick of headlights, but a figure other drivers had met. Tyler's encounter with the convoy of jeeps became something more than a private hallucination, once he heard other truckers echo the same details. The olive drab paint, the white stars, the faces that never turned. When people share these moments, it's not just about validation. It's about realizing that the strange and unexplained are woven into the fabric of these roads. The open road, especially at night, strips away the distractions that usually keep us grounded in the present. There's a vulnerability that comes from being alone in a car, surrounded by darkness, knowing that help is far away. This isolation isn't just physical, it's psychological. The highway becomes a kind of stage, and the mind fills in what's missing. Sometimes that means seeing things that aren't there. Sometimes it means noticing what others overlook. Either way, the line between reality and imagination thins out. Drivers become more likely to interpret ambiguous events, like a figure by the roadside or a shape in the fog, as something meaningful, especially if the stories are already in the air. But these stories don't linger simply because they're strange. It's the emotional weight that makes them stick. Each encounter is colored by loss. A driver who never made it home, a woman searching for help in the wrong decade, a boy repeating his warning, a convoy that never reached its destination. The people who see them aren't just frightened. They're unsettled by the sense that something is unfinished, that the past is pressing in on the present. These aren't tales of evil or vengeance. They're stories of longing, regret, and the need to be noticed or remembered. The warnings and pleas that echo through these encounters add another layer. Ben's boy at the track says, "Don't stop here." Rachel's passenger thanks her for being the first to stop in a long time. Even the man at mile marker 23, though silent, seems to be waiting for something, a recognition, a witness, maybe a chance to be found. These moments force drivers into the story. They're not just observers, they're participants, drawn into a narrative that started long before they arrived. That's why the stories feel so personal, even when the details repeat from one driver to the next. There's also a sense of community that grows up around these stories. When a deputy tells Eli, "You're not the first to see him," it's more than just reassurance. It's an invitation to join a group of people who've all brushed up against the same mystery. Truckers at a rest stop trade stories about the convoy. Neighbors talk about the woman in the red scarf as if she's part of the local landscape. These shared experiences build a kind of folklore, a set of rules and warnings that get passed along with directions and weather updates. The stories become a way of making sense of what can't be explained and of coping with the unease that comes from not knowing. The roads themselves seem to encourage this. Their emptiness, their distance from towns and crowds, makes them the perfect places for stories to take root. The darkness and the silence don't just hide what's real. They make space for what's missing. A driver alone at night is both exposed and invisible, a witness to things that don't show up in daylight. That's why the details matter. The color of a jacket, the sound of footsteps, the shape of a face in the headlights. They're small, but they're enough to convince someone that what they saw was real. Over time, these stories start to shape the way people move through the landscape. Some drivers avoid certain stretches of road. Others keep their eyes straight ahead when they pass a particular marker or crossing. The stories aren't just entertainment. They're warnings, reminders of what's been lost, and invitations to remember what came before. They become part of the road's identity, as much as the bends and turns or the faded signs. What's most unsettling is how these stories blur the boundaries between past and present. The living and the dead, the real and the imagined, start to overlap. The boy at the railroad crossing doesn't just haunt the tracks. He tries to protect others from his fate. The convoy isn't just a memory. It's a presence that repeats itself year after year. The man at mile marker 23 stands as a reminder that some disappearances are never solved, not in the usual sense. And the woman in the red scarf, waiting for a ride, is a question that never quite gets answered. These encounters remind us that the road isn't just a route from one place to another. It's a record of what's happened and what's still unresolved. The stories that surface, sometimes in a rush of adrenaline, sometimes in a quiet moment of recognition, are reminders that solitude is never as simple as it seems. The places we think of as empty are often the ones most crowded with memory. As drivers, we become part of that story, whether we want to or not. The next time you find yourself on a lonely stretch of highway, you might remember a warning, a face, or a story you heard secondhand. The road keeps its secrets, but it also shares them with those who are willing to listen. And that's why, for some, the journey is never just about getting from one place to another. It's about what you notice along the way and what you carry with you after the headlights have faded. The road holds onto its mysteries, and sometimes it asks us to do the same. The open road becomes something different after midnight. For Eli Turner, the stranger at mile 23 was more than just a shadow. He was a reminder that some stories never end. Rachel Monroe's late drive brought her face to face with a woman whose red scarf marked a history that wouldn't let go. Ben Carter's warning at the railroad crossing echoed with loss, and Tyler Brooks saw a convoy vanish, The white stars on faded Jeeps burned into his memory. Each of these encounters shows how familiar highways can turn into places where the past and present collide. Remember, when the highway goes silent, the past might be riding shotgun, just like that stranger at mile 23, or the convoy that disappeared. If you've ever had a late-night encounter or something you can't explain on the road, share your story in the comments. And if you want more true life mysteries, hit subscribe.